cloudy start to this Wednesday morning. Joining us in the studio, we have author Rundy Purdy. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
It's good to be here.
You are the author of A Sea is Wide.
That's correct.
Now, I could read what Mr. Hankey sent to us in this press release, the executive director of Benson Memorial Library, but then there'd be no sense of having you on the show. So let's actually get your background. And before we talk about the book, where are you from?
Well, I'm from living out in the country, so when people ask me that question, I have to give it like the nearest city is. So if you're familiar with Binghamton, New York, that is the nearest city, but we live a good half hour out in the country away from that. So Binghamton, New York, that's about as close as you can get and still be a major metropolitan area.
Wow. You enjoy growing up in the country?
Absolutely. I couldn't imagine doing it any other way myself.
Talk about family.
I am the second oldest of 12 kids. I was homeschooled growing up. We had a little passel of animals, not a real farm, you could call it a farmette, but mostly it was for fun. We had a few goats, a few chickens, a few ducks. And after I grew up, I played around with college a little bit, took one or two courses, but I ultimately decided that it wasn't really helping me pursue the kind of writing career I wanted to pursue. So I ended up full-time trying to pursue my own writing. And then at 24, my grandfather became very ill with his Alzheimer's, no longer able to live independently, and that started the Alzheimer's journey, which is covered in that book.
Were you close with your grandfather?
They came every time we had a birthday party, and we were on good, friendly terms, but he was a very distant man, so I would say prior to my taking care of him, we were not really close. But through the caregiving experience, I became very close to him.
So, and I'm sure that's what the book is about.
Yes.
Let's talk about the book. When did you think, okay, you know what, this would be good material?
Well, I guess as a writer, I'm sensitive to how all of life has the potential of being a story. So I would say, even going into it, I knew this is a story. All of life is a story. But I can't say I was sure I could make it into something I could write and share when I first went into it. The actual book had its seed, had its beginning when I was doing the caregiving, and it's a very emotional experience. It's very hard. So kind of as my self-therapy, in the evening time after Grandpa was in bed, I'd sit down and I'd write a blog post about the things that happened today, and I'd stay up to 11 o'clock at night writing, and I kind of just poured everything out. And after the caregiving experience was over, I had like a book this thick of a blog post. And after that, I had to say, well, is there anything in here I can share with the general public in a cohesive way? So in the years after that, which was, I finished taking care of him in 2009. I took care of my grandmother for another 5 years after that. But during those years after my grandfather passed, I had to kind of digest what happened to me and then come back to material and say, what can I share in a book form? And so by last June, my grandmother passed, and my book was just about finished at that point. I had the last polishing off to do, and so I polished it off, and this June it was published.
Let's backtrack just a little bit.
Sure.
When did you know you wanted to become an author?
15.
15?
Yes. I read a book that was called Do You Have a Book Inside You? And it was one of those kind of inspirational, you can do it sort of books. And at that point, I told myself, I want to be a fiction writer. It's kind of like one of those, you want to be a fireman, you want to be an astronaut, or you want to be a world-famous author. And I wanted to be a successful author. So I started writing fiction at that point. I never dreamed I would write a factual book. I enjoyed writing essays and slice-of-life humorous sort of things, but I always thought fiction writing was what I enjoyed, but it was only when I went through the caregiving experience with my grandfather and realized how meaningful it was and realized how my story impacted other people that I got bitten by the bug to share that story and write something that was actually true to life.
So what writings influenced you? What did you grow up reading?
I grew up reading fantasy, science fiction a bit, Terry Brooks, I guess some Robert Jordan. It's kind of odd that I did a lot of essay slice of life kind of writing. I didn't really read a lot of that growing up. Since my adult years, I've read a bit of that kind of stuff. I read a book that was called, I forget the name of the title, but it was an author's kind of essays of her life growing up, which I really connected with. But that was something I did as an adult and kind of realized, oh wow, I can write these kind of things as well. I like this kind of writing, and that was only as an adult. As a younger person, it was always fiction.
We're hoping that this is the year I get out of the Dick and Jane series. I'm very close to moving on to something bigger.
Move on to the Diary of the Wimpy Kid.
Well, that might be pushing it. Dr. Seuss is a struggle at times. Mark, The Sea is Wide. Not only is this necessarily a book about Alzheimer's, but caregiving and love. You, Mark, know what that's like. You have family that you take care of.
This is, and I have to admit to you, I have not read your book, but I have read all of the reviews. I've read the things that people have written about it. I've read your bio, and I have connected very much with the things that have been said about the book, especially by other people who are caregivers. I have a brother who suffers from epilepsy and cerebral palsy all at the same time, and that can be the same kind of experience. I imagine there were times for you where you just really wanted to throw the towel in with this, and other times where it was probably one of the greatest things that ever happened to you.
Absolutely.
I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that kind of juxtaposition.
Well, absolutely. But first, I'll back up and agree with you that book, I think, can help any kind of caregiver, because the caregiving experience is very universal with those struggles with wanting to throw in the towel, feeling very alone. That's one thing. You talk with caregivers, and oftentimes they feel very alone.
Yes.
But moving on to your question was, again?
How this can be something that is so good, yet so challenging all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, a big kind of parallel I often see between caregiving for any kind of loved one is there's much that's similar with being a mother. And how, mothers oftentimes say they want to throw in the towel, but, they persevere with it. And I think because caregiving really distills down what life is about, the challenges of life, of loving people and sacrificing yourself so that they might be taken care of and they might have their needs provided for. And it is really reflective of the challenges of life, of living up to standards of what love calls you to do for other people, and how it can be rewarding, but also how it does cost you something in time, in emotion, in doing things that you might want to do. But yes, I think ultimately we discover that it is sacrificing our time, our desires to meet the needs of those we love, that we understand what is most important in life.
One of the things that I found most interesting in reading about all of this and just listening to you now is that you described your grandfather as a very distant person, somebody who was always very nice, and somebody you wanted to know, but someone who was distant.
It's just my relationship with Mark. Keep him at a distance.
Yeah, arm's length. What were some of the things that maybe drew you a little bit closer to him over time?
Well, the caregiving experience is very, I guess I'd use the word intimate. Like for a mother caring for their child, they feed them, they clothe them, they take care of all the needs they have, whether it be emotional, mental, and Alzheimer's kind of goes in the reverse in that you start with somebody who is your equal, they have all their mental abilities still with them, and they start, in a sense, going back to square one. And so as my grandfather began to decline, he needed help getting his shoes on. Eventually got to the point where he needed help doing all of his dressing. He needed help with his food. Like at first he needed it cut up for him, and eventually got to the point where he needed me to feed him. But through that progress, he had a lot of emotional needs where he's obviously struggling emotionally with the disease and losing his ability to think well. And so he began to depend upon me for the emotional support to struggle through those kind of things. About a year into the disease, he started calling me by the name of his brother Gene. He had an older brother, Gene. Now, when my grandfather was about 10 or 12, his father committed suicide and kind of left the family without a father figure. Wow. And his older brother, Gene, looked out for him. And so as I was taking care of him and looking out for him, in his mind, I began to become merged with Gene. So for me, it kind of got to the point where it felt like Grandpa was like a brother to me. I was doing the stuff you do for a younger brother. And as my caregiving progressed, so that I was tucking him into bed at night, I was singing him songs, reading him stories. Emotionally, it started for me to feel like he was like my own child. Now, of course, intellectually, I knew he was my grandfather. That didn't get confused. But emotionally, when you're tucking someone into bed at night and answering their fears and concerns and giving their hugs when they're afraid and doing all those things emotionally, you get so intertwined with them. It's like you're taking care of your own child.
Did you, at any point of this process, look at him and because you guys were distant, and start to connect the dots and say, I see a little bit of myself, or I understand, maybe where that personality trait or, has been passed down?
Absolutely. When you're living that close to somebody, you get to really know their quirks, what makes them tick the way they are. I will say, living that close to both my grandparents, my grandmother was still alive at that time, I got to understand a lot about the family dynamic that my father grew up in, and a lot of what made my father the way he was. Like, I know why my father was like that, because my grandmother and my grandfather are like this, and I definitely got to understand the whole family a lot better just by being one of my grandparents. But yes, as a person, as an individual, I got to know what made my grandfather who he was a lot better.
One of the things that I picked up on also in reading about all of this is that you mentioned that at some point you realized that this was a man who used what faculties he still had to kind of fight this disease. He was dealing with this on his own terms. What was that like?
It was fascinating. I wish everybody could get to know someone who has Alzheimer's well, so they could understand how much the person is still there and still struggling with the disease in a intellectual way. Every person who has Alzheimer's has their own particular battlegrounds that mean a real lot to them. For my grandfather, he was a very neat man. He was like to be very respectable and do things appropriately. And he started forgetting how to use the bathroom. Now, he knew he needed to use the bathroom, but he forgot how it would work. So we would have hours spent trying to figure out the bathroom. One time he called my grandmother in and said, "Ma, I'm trying to get the toilet to work." And so she came in and she said, "What's the problem?" He says, "Well, I can't figure out how to pump the water from here," he pointed at the sink, "and to here," and he pointed to the toilet. And she said, "You don't need to." Well, he said, "Well, then how am I going to take a crap?" Because he couldn't figure out how his body and the bathroom related to each other. And that's just one example of how he struggled so hard to continue to process things even in his Alzheimer's. And it makes you have such compassion for someone with Alzheimer's when you realize that they're forgetting, and they realize they're forgetting. They're not like just blissfully wandering off into the mist. They are struggling with the fact that they realize that they've lost things they used to know how to do, and it used to be very simple for them to do. So that's just one example.
Oh my!
How did you? I mean, it sounds like there were some pretty tense moments emotionally for you. How do you escape that? How did you kind of break away for a little bit to just take a deep breath and say, you know what, this is challenging, but it's worth it?
Well, there's kind of the day-to-day, and then there's the weekly. Every week on Saturday, a family member would come up and stay for like 8 hours with my grandparents to take care of Grandpa, and I got to go away and visit with my immediate family, and I would just, everything from the week would come out of my mouth. I just vent everything out, and it was a way of letting off steam, of being validated, of coping. So I did that every week, and that was vital for me to be able to stay in a somewhat healthy state of mind.
Yeah.
And a day-to-day...
So it didn't necessarily push you away from family. You were able to still say, I can go to and see my parents. I can.
My immediate family.
Okay.
The aunts and uncles, some of them weren't really on the same page about Grandpa's disease and really how sick he was. So I had to be careful with the more extended family. My immediate family, yes, I could share very freely. I could, and it was very good for me. Some caregivers don't have that ability, which is very difficult for them. But on a day-to-day basis, for me, coping was exercise. I'm a somewhat introverted person, so for me it wasn't going out and having a beer with the buddies. That's the way some people cope. But for me, every day I needed to exercise. Sometimes it was late at night, sometimes early in the morning, but exercise allowed me to step back and kind of flush all the tension out of my system and kind of reset the clock, so to speak.
I want to ask you, for me, when I'm writing anything, which is rare, obviously, getting that first word or that first sentence down is the most difficult. Once you get that,
the blank
page, once you get that down, then it seems to flow. So here's your first line. It's strange how life travels in full circles. The years roll past, and what once was is now reversed. Mm-hmm. How long did it take to come up with that line?
Well, for me as a writer, the really powerful writing...
You're going to say 30 seconds, aren't you?
Well, actually, like I say, I don't really know, because those things well up from within inside me, and I think they percolate in the subconscious. So consciously, by the time I sat down to write, that was already there. It was kind of written out in my mind. I wrote that originally for my grandfather's birthday, December 2006. I've been living with him for a few months, and I was starting to just first really understand what this was going to be all about, going through Alzheimer's. So that was originally a blog post that I wrote, and I then edited it and adjusted it to fit in with the book. But emotionally, when you go through certain things, it kind of writes it in its mind for me when it's something a very powerful experience. So now school papers, those ones, that first line of school paper are going to be really hard.
Right. Let's talk about today's event. You're going to be in Titusville all day.
That's right.
Later on, early this evening, you're going to be at Benson Memorial Library.
Yep.
Talk about that.
So I am trying to go to wherever people will have me and talk about Alzheimer's and caregiving and support for caregivers. And the people at the Benson Library, Justin was so gracious as to invite me to come speak at their library. It's not a how-to talk. It is a story sharing. I'm sharing my story because I have found that what helps people the most as caregivers and as people who have caregivers in their family or people who have Alzheimer's in their family, what helps them most is to hear someone else's story about how they went through it. And when they hear that, it connects with them. They go, oh, I see how that resonates with what I'm going through, with what my loved one is going through. And it allows them to organically apply things to their own life. I had an event a couple weeks ago, and there was a nurse at the library, and the librarian was like, oh, come listen to this talk. And the nurse was like, I know all about Alzheimer's. I don't need to come to a talk. But the librarian browbeat the nurse into coming. And afterwards, I take questions after the talk, and afterwards the nurse said, I think every nurse and every healthcare worker in nursing homes should hear what you're saying, because it really shows the human side of what going through Alzheimer's is like, and it really can help caregivers, help professional caregivers understand how to interact with family and with the patients. So it is a talk that's not only for those who are immediately dealing with it, but for family, for the community, to help them understand what Alzheimer's is like and to be able to support those who are dealing with it.
Did your respect for caregivers increase?
Well, I have to say I probably didn't really even think about caregivers before I was one. You're 24. What are you thinking about? You're not thinking about caregivers. So at 24, I can't say I disrespected them. It wasn't even on my radar. So yeah, it increased my respect a lot for caregivers, for what it's like to go through hard things in life. Just whether you're the one suffering with cancer or divorce or any of those hard things in life, having gone through it with somebody, I realize how those are weights we carry and how those leave scars on us that really change how we view life.
And how we deal with things like that too. Mm-hmm. Because you mentioned, all of the ways that you used as safety valves, you wrote, you exercised, among other things, and it's also commendable that you were so young that you decided that this was something that, you could devote your life to for a period of time that you didn't know how long was going to be.
I did not know how long it was going to be.
It was just something that you apparently decided needed to be done.
Right, right. Go ahead.
Well, being 24 at the time, you must have gained 15, 20 years of experience in that short period of time.
Something like that. How do we quantify it?
Yeah.
But yeah, it changes you. I don't know. I'm not able to step outside myself and see it. But when you go through something like that, you feel a lot older. I mean, you can't have such a close experience with sickness and ultimately death and come away feeling young.
Well, before we wrap things up here, what's next for you?
What's next? I got a lot more events throughout the summer and the fall as far as talks. I have 2 in this area, well, in the western PA area, I would say. I have one in Greenville, the Greenville Public Library, on tomorrow, It starts at 6. And I have one at Sharon, PA, the Shenango Valley Public Library, on Saturday at 1 p.m. So that's locally. Then I have events in various places throughout the rest of the fall. I'd like to continue writing. It's awful hard to go on tour and write at the same time, but I have written a bunch of essays about people who have passed, not just with Alzheimer's, but I know people and they eventually get old and they die. Something happens to all of us. And I've been moved to write about their lives, and I've really impacted people by what I've written in that. And so I have a bunch of essays kind of laying around. It's like, you know what? I really ought to bring them together and collect them as a book, reflecting on life and what living and dying means. So that's hopefully.
So you want to continue with that instead of maybe writing something else to sort of escape from this at the moment?
I might do both at the same time because, yes, there is that urge to escape as well. I have several fiction books in my mind as well.
Excellent. Rundy, it's a real pleasure meeting you this morning, and big thanks to Justin for inviting you to the library and onto this program. Again, the book is The Sea is Wide, a memoir of caregiving. Rundy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
All righty.
Pleasure being here.
Final look at news coming up next.